Picture from Rosenberg, Holland, was formed in 1978 with Rinus Vreugdenhil on bass and Lawrence Bakker on drums. They'd eventually be joined by Jan Beckham on guitar and Ronald van Proyen on vocals to record a demo with the track My Gun Shoots, which got a decent amount of airplay on Dutch radio. It also got them signed to Warner Brothers, but Picture decided to not go through with it when they felt Warner was trying to push them into a more pop-driven direction. They would instead sign with Backdoor Records, a subsidiary of Phonogram Records, to release their debut album, Picture One. Picture One is certainly not a bad album, but much of it leans a little more hard rock than heavy metal, similar to stuff like Foghat or Golden Earring, who'd been huge in the Netherlands since the mid-60s. Overall, it's still pretty good raw stuff, with a handful of tracks tapping into some new wave of British heavy metal vibes, like the more Judas Priest-influenced track Get Back or You Fall, or the up-tempo rocker One Way Street. My favorite song off here, though, is probably the album closer, Fear, a 7-minute epic that spends most of its time with a slow build and emotional vocals from Ronald.
It frightened me so, had no place to go. Wanna scream and shout, wanna spit it out, yes. Spit it out!
But it eventually breaks into Jan's powerful guitar playing, punctuated by heavy, cathartic drumming from Lawrence. The debut album was a huge success in the Netherlands, but made little impact outside of Picture's home country. But that would start to change with the release of their second album in 1981, Heavy Metal Ears.
We're gonna bring the road in our revolution. Every day I remember at school. It will be a world of destruction. We're gonna knock out the disco fool.
This album is pretty great, with much more of a focus on traditional heavy metal in the vein of bands like Saxon, and featuring more head-banging riffs and catchier choruses than the previous album.
Happy metal is. Happy metal is. Hang on everyone I see. Rock and roll's gonna give them to me. Happy metal is. Happy metal is. Happy metal is. Happy metal is.
The music is a lot more driving here, with a little more attitude. And while there are still some 70s elements in there, including some golden earring touches, they take a back seat here to a more modern sound.
I want romance, but you want speed. I want your love, that's what I need. You wanna live life flying high. You wanna make it, wonder why. I don't know where you may be. I don't know 'cause I can't see.
Are some of the tracks a bit simplistic? Sure, but they still rock. Even though this is about as traditional as metal can get, this album still manages to be pretty addictive, with memorable cuts like Unemployed.
We got no time for problems. Money so they see. Wait until the top will turn, and it will always be. Unemployed, feeling annoyed. Unemployed, feel destroyed. Unemployed.
Overall, this is a super solid album with a lot of energy, although they do sneak in a very sultry song with the first half of a two-part closer, Rock and Roll. Heavy Metal Ears feels much more focused than Picture One to me, with a pretty clear new wave of British heavy metal influence. Although it does, inexplicably, have 6 different covers, including one that's just a reskin of the first album. Anyway, before Picture could record a third album, vocalist Ronald Van Proyen would leave for personal reasons. He'd be replaced by Shmolik Avigal, whose only appearance as Picture vocalist would be 1982's Diamond Dreamer. This is another really solid traditional heavy metal album, this time with a super clean production that sounds great, but does take away some of the rawness of previous albums. But regardless, everyone sounds amazing here, including Shmolik, who brings a Dio or Coverdale-ish quality to the music. Considered a classic Dutch metal album, Diamond Dreamer is very guitar-oriented and full of killer licks and riffs. The energy is undeniable, with Judas Priest meets Rainbow vibes and super present bass and drums, giving every track a very heavy, powerful sound.
No one to tell how the rules are set. No one to win in my last bet. I heard a message from hell. I heard a message from hell.
I will say, compared to some other Picture albums, Diamond Dreamer is a little light on really hooky choruses, but the focus here seems to be less on catchy melodies and more on fist-pumping attitude, balls-to-the-wall riffage, and smoking solos. Although, once again, they end things on a softer note with the great album closer, You're Touching Me. So Diamond Dreamer didn't see major sales, but positive reviews helped Picture build their fan base. Unfortunately though, this lineup would not last long. First, they'd bring on second guitarist Chris Van Jaarsveld at the suggestion of Schmalik for a bigger live sound, which must have happened very quickly since Chris is credited as a third guitarist on some releases of Diamond Dreamer. But original guitarist Jan Beckham apparently wasn't into the two-guitar thing, and he'd end up leaving. Then Schmalik would get into an argument with the band's management and get kicked out. So Picture would then bring on another second guitarist, Henry Van Manen, as well as British vocalist Pete Lavelle to round out the group. With a drastically different sound, this refreshed lineup would release Picture's fourth album, Eternal Dark, in 1983.
Do you ever wonder, do you ever think, what may lie beyond you, what's the missing link? Will you enter the paradise? Will you see the light? What is your destination? Your heart will see eternal
I'm a huge fan of this era of Picture and Eternal Dark. It's high energy, powerful, and super catchy. With tracks like Battle for the Universe and Griffin's Guard the Gold, there's definitely more of a pumped up 80s feel on this one.
traveling onward, come to claim our share. Never take the mountains slow. Griffin's got the gold. Listen to the legend told. Griffin's got the gold.
Pete Lavelle sounds great too. While he's maybe not as polished as Schmalik, for me, his semi-gruff vocals are a perfect fit for the style.
Moving through space in my mind, gotta pass into the zone. Living with a dream I can find. Gotta make it on my own. Please tell me why I'm flying in
And as for the guitar playing, Chris and Henry are super solid and work really well together. I mean, the riffs are nothing groundbreaking, but they're fun, energetic, and powerful, with some nice solos that are a bit more technical than Jan's were. If you're looking for melodic, old-school heavy metal, you can't go wrong with Eternal Dark. It was considered a success upon its release, but it didn't sell quite well enough for the band to afford to tour, even though they apparently had several offers. The following year, drummer Lawrence Bakker would leave the group to focus on family. He'd be replaced by Jacques Van Uvelen. And in 1985, this lineup would record the fifth Picture album, Traitor. This is my favorite Picture album. While it's definitely similar to Eternal Dark in approach, Traitor contains some of the band's most insanely catchy choruses, including the opening title track.
Why do you question the rules that are set by your king? Why do you question the law that protects the right things? Why do you question the rules that are set by your king? Why do you question the law that protects the right things? Traitor!
I think every track on here is at least pretty darn good, and some go even beyond that for me, like Dying to Live is awesome, and my personal favorite Picture song, Lost in the Night.
Shadows will danger and despair. We never can return us in the night. Oh, we never can return. Wait for all the trees. Voices wanna be. No soul of glory lies. What tonight?
Plus, while I like the solos well enough on Eternal Dark, they're even better here. This time with more classical touches and flashy technical passages. All that said, I could see some metalheads being turned off somewhat by the poppy heights of a track like Fantasies, for example. But I dig it, and it was actually a small hit at the time.
You haunt me all of the time. I don't need a dream, I need what is real. Tell me that you'll be mine. I wanna touch but I can't quite reach out. I wanna feel but my hands are tied. I need a hang on the world I believe in. Fantasies that easily lie. Fantasies.
While Traitor was well received for the most part, and even got a release in Canada, the momentum would drop out of the band at this point, with only Rinus and Jacques sticking around, as Picture still had to fulfill the rest of their contract with Phonogram Records. So they'd bring on guitarist Rob Van Enkhuizen, keyboard player Ronald de Graaf, and former Vandenberg vocalist Bert Heerink. to record Every Story Needs Another Picture in 1986. It actually starts off kinda promising with Battle Cruiser, followed by Moving Down the Line, which both sound very inspired by Perfect Strangers era Deep Purple. And like I said, it actually works pretty well on the first couple of tracks, with old school vibes and a lot of Hammond organ. But the rest of the album is a mess of commercial-leaning soft rock styles, with some prog, blues, and pop mixed in. There's the folky acoustic ballad Stay With Me, some bad 80s pop with She Was Made for Lovin', and the bluesy Zeppelin-ish rocker You Took My Money, You Took My Pride. And then there's the ultra-poppy Stand Back for the People in Charge, which sounds like it wouldn't have felt too out of place on a Wang Chung album or something.
Police cars saw the scene of a crime. Now there's people everywhere. Too late, they couldn't get there in time, but dead bodies just don't care. Stand back for the people in charge. Do you know what's going on? Stand back for the people in charge, but the killer is already gone.
But whether the change in direction was coming from the label or the band themselves, Every Story Needs Another Picture is a swing at a commercial sound, but very little seems to land. Unfortunately, the same can be said about the mediocre follow-up as well, Marathon, from 1987. They don't do away with the old school touches completely, but Marathon leans even more into the ultra glossy commercial sound with more colorful, smiley, soft rock tracks.
When the city's on fire and the battle's about to begin, it's too late for a quick solution. I'm not sure they cannot win.
Somehow, though, Marathon did get a video for the single We Just Can't Lose, which kinda sounds like the end credits music to a bad 80s movie.
We've got the key for something different, for new arrangements. We'll stand together, we'll never see. We just can't lose, because we're standing alright, and we've got the power to show it to them.
are still some cool solos here, but honestly, it's hardly worth getting to them. And if I had to pick out a positive aside from that, I suppose the closing track, Sarah, has some cool bass and keyboards, and comes the closest to something I might listen to again.
You won't see me cry for running around on Sarah. Your love is enough. Oh, Sarah, you're no longer mine. Oh, Sarah, now that it's over.
This album pretty much put an end to the band for a while, with Picture splitting up indefinitely. In 1995, original guitarist Jan Beckham would attempt to revive Picture with a new lineup, but they never made it past recording some demos. However, the band would successfully get back together in 2007, with Jan and Rob Van Enkhuizen on guitars, Lorenz on drums, Rinus on bass, and Pete Lavelle back on vocals. And in 2009, this lineup would release a new Picture album titled Old Dogs, New Tricks.
Turn my head down low. No, my mind won't roll. Teaching old time new tricks. Teaching old time new tricks.
Overall, I have to say, this album is pretty good, better than expected in fact, and for the most part goes back into a heavier, faster direction, featuring a mix of old school and modern sounds, but leaning heavily into those 70s and 80s vibes. It is a bit uneven though, in the sense that some songs on here are just okay for me, especially in the first half or so, but the second half is full of great stuff, starting with track 6, Just Incredible.
You gotta shine like a light. I couldn't put up a fight. It's incredible. Can't resist the miracle. Just incredible. Can't resist a miracle.
It is a bit more on the modern side, but a really catchy, heavy track, and stuff like A Better Soul and Choosing Your Sign are also great tracks that showcase more modern sounds. But there are also some fantastic old school sounding songs on here too, which were highlights for me.
But who can you trust when love to the dust? And who could be better, my friend? Just tell me, who can you trust?
And of course, probably my favorite track on the album, Celtic Cross.
Eyes that are full and fierce. Eyes are alive. Spread my belief in lore. Believe it or die. Whoa, carving my Celtic cross. Whoa, carving my Celtic cross.
Jan Beckham would leave the band once again not long after the release of Old Dog's New Tricks and be replaced by guitarist Pete Bourbon. And the following year, Rob Van Enkhuizen would also leave, being replaced first by Hurt Nybor and then American guitarist Mike Ferguson. With two new guitarists in place, Picture would eventually release their 9th album, Warhorse, in 2012.
Legions of warriors, troops at my side. Life of the conqueror, life of the pride. There's nothing worry me. Send
Warhorse is largely along the same lines as Old Dog's New Tricks, but a bit more modern at times and a touch more aggressive, even going into some power metal with the excellent opener, Battle Plan.
We'll drive the force. Battle plan. Fight the wars. Battle plan. Chase the lords. Battle plan. When I make my battle plan.
And I will admit this album took a bit to grow on me, possibly because Battle Plan is so badass, it might have overshadowed some of the other tracks upon a first listen. But regardless, Warhorse overall delivers some very cool stuff that still harkens back to Picture's 70s and 80s roots. And Pete Lavelle's voice has aged, but in a great way, and he sounds fantastic on both the more modern stuff and the old school rockers. There's even what I would consider Picture's best ballad on here, with Think I Lost My Way.
Where is the strength in me? What is the right belief? And I think I lost my way. It all turned out wrong. I thought we were strong. What can you do when the right way is wrong? Just illusions, just illusions.
Pete Bourbon and Mike Ferguson also do a really nice job on here as well, doing a lot to bring in that refreshed feel and laying down some very cool solos. There are a few slower, groovier tracks on here that didn't resonate with me as much, but they may hit differently for you.
Are there demons here, playing on our fears? There is space in here with another life, looking in on us, trying to feed our loves. No more dust to dust, take me to the light. When I'm alone, when I'm alone.
This album would get a little momentum behind Picture again, and they'd start touring, but Pete Bourbon couldn't do it for some reason, so he'd be replaced first by guitarist Len Roygrock and then Andre Willems. However, in 2016, Pete Lavelle would leave Picture to start up his own group called Lavelle's Blade, taking both guitarists with him. So the remaining members, Rinus and Lorenz, decided to reform the original lineup, with both Jan Beckham and Ronald Van Proyen returning. And along with second guitarist Appie de Gelder, who joined in 2018, the classic lineup of Picture would put out Wings on Pure Steel Records in 2019.
What is life? What is it worth? Why are we here on earth? Oh, here on earth, here on earth. Is it for joy, laughter, or faith?
With Wings, Picture does a really solid job of recapturing the energy of their classic albums, and a lot of this has a very old school sound, especially on tracks like Empty Room, Still Standing, and Is It Real?
I'm suffering every day. I'm thinking every day. I have so much to say. Oh,
There's also a little blues rock on here and more Deep Purple style stuff, and a couple of tracks that lean a little more into a hard rock vein than heavy metal. And it's worth mentioning that there are some nice solos on here as well. But of the three 21st Century Picture albums, I'd probably put this one at the bottom, since it contains fewer tracks that really grab me. But it's still a very strong effort, and it's cool just to see the original lineup back together again. But since that most recent Picture release, both Ronald and Jan have left, being replaced by vocalist Peter Strikes, ironically also a former Vandenberg vocalist, and former guitarist Len Roygrock. They're still active but haven't released any new albums since Wings. Hopefully we'll hear more soon. Until then, here's your Picture homework. I'd start with Heavy Metal Ears from 1981, and Diamond Dreamer from 1982 is definitely a classic, but Eternal Dark from 1983 and Traitor from 1985 are my personal favorites. After that, I'd go directly to Old Dog's New Tricks from 2009, Warhorse from 2012, and Give Wings from 2019 a shot if you want to hear some cool later stuff by the original lineup. I hope you enjoyed this look back at Picture, the Godfathers of Dutch heavy metal. I think their biggest mistake was turning to an almost AOR style in 1986, when heavy metal still had a solid 4 years at least of ruling the airwaves. But still, Picture have some excellent albums, and even their more recent stuff is pretty solid. So give it a listen and let me know what you think. As always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.